Good morning. The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection will come to order. The Subcommittee is meeting this morning to receive testimony regarding how the federal government understands and manages enterprise-wide cybersecurity risks. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. As we convene today, this subcommittee is concerned that the federal government is not yet equipped to determine how threat actors seek to gain access to our private information. This challenge is one of the reasons I introduced, and yesterday the full committee passed, the Advancing Cybersecurity Diagnostics and Mitigation Act. H.R. 6443 will codify and provide direction to DHS regarding the CDM program. This was a bipartisan effort, and I thank the ranking member, Mr. Richmond, as well as Mr. Katko, Mr. Donovan, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and Mr. Langevin for working with me on this important issue, because there is an evident lack of strategy in mitigating risk across our federal agencies. Cyber workforce gaps and legacy IT systems are vulnerabilities in the federal government's cybersecurity posture, but the efficacy of our basic cybersecurity practices remain common liabilities. To this end, the Office of Management and Budget and Department of Homeland Security released a report earlier this year entitled Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination Report Action Plan. This report spoke to many of the challenges faced in securing enterprise-wide federal government IT systems. Perhaps not surprisingly, OMB and DHS determined that 74% of government agencies have cybersecurity programs that are either at risk or at high risk. The risk assessments performed by these agencies showed that a lack of threat information results in ineffective allocations of limited cyber resources. This overall situation creates enterprise-wide gaps in our network visibility, IT tool and capability standardization, and common operating procedures, all of which negatively impact federal cybersecurity. Given the significant and ever-increasing danger of threats and the absence of good data inventory, risk management must be fully integrated into every aspect of an organization. Leaders of federal agencies at all organizational levels must understand their responsibilities, and they must be accountable for protecting organizational assets and managing security and privacy risks. The OMB and DHS report identified 4 main actions that are necessary to address cybersecurity risks across the federal enterprise. First, federal agencies must increase their cybersecurity threat awareness. This seems like a too obvious of a recommendation, but often those charged with defending agency networks lack timely information regarding the tactics, techniques, and procedures that our adversaries are using to exploit government information systems. Second, OMB urged agencies to standardize IT and cybersecurity capabilities to control costs and to improve asset management. Generally speaking, agencies do not have standardized cybersecurity processes, which ultimately impacts their ability to efficiently and effectively combat cyber threats. The Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, or CDM, will accelerate both IT management efforts and cybersecurity improvements across the federal government. In fact, my bill, the Advancing Cybersecurity Diagnostics and Mitigation Act, will require the program to evolve, thereby ensuring that agency CIOs and DHS have the visibility necessary not only to combat threats, but also to target modernization resources and efforts where they are most needed. The third recommended action is that agencies must consolidate their security operations centers to improve incident detection and response capabilities. OMB found that only 27% of agencies can detect and investigate attempts to access large volumes of data. This troubling statistic should cause us all to pause. While the report identifies that federal agencies currently lack network visibility, DHS's CDM program can assist with this issue by providing insight into what is occurring on networks. After all, you can't defend what you can't see. And finally, OMB recommended that agencies increase accountability through improved governance processes. Indeed, both the Federal Information Security Management Act and President Trump's executive order on strengthening the cybersecurity and federal networks and critical infrastructure already identify the agency head as the official ultimately responsible for each agency's cybersecurity. Of course, agency heads often delegate cyber risk management responsibilities to the Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Security Officer, but agency leadership should increase its oversight of and its engagement in their agency's cybersecurity ecosystem. Ultimately, a collaborative approach to mitigating cyber threats is meant to prioritize meeting the needs of DHS's partners and is consistent with the growing recognition among government, academic, and corporate leaders that cybersecurity is increasingly interdependent across sectors and must be a core aspect of risk management strategies. We are in an era that requires flexibility, resiliency, and discipline. And I look forward to a candid conversation with our witnesses today about ensuring our federal networks can embody these goals. Your thoughts and opinions are important as we oversee the state of federal government cybersecurity risks. The Chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond, for his opening statement.
Good morning, and I want to thank Chairman Ratcliffe for holding today's hearing on the Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination Report and Action Plan. It's no secret that federal networks are an attractive target to our adversaries and cyber criminals alike. Thales eSecurity 2018 Data Threat Report found federal agencies experience more data breaches than any other sector. State actors, such as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, have become more sophisticated, more emboldened, and more brazen. And the data stored on our networks about American citizens, our national security plans, and our economy is important to them. We have authorized and funded programs to defend our federal networks, and this subcommittee has performed rigorous oversight over many of them this Congress. I am familiar with the challenges related to implementation of the Department of Homeland Security's Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program, CDM, as well as cyber threat information sharing. So I wasn't terribly surprised by some of the Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination Report's general findings. But the devil is in the details. I could have told you, for example, that the collective ability of our federal agencies to understand what is happening on their networks isn't what it should be. But I didn't realize that fewer than half of the 96 agencies surveyed can detect encrypted exfiltration of information at target levels, or that only 27% can detect and investigate attempts to access large volumes of data. I knew that resource challenges have stunted the maturation of programs designed to protect federal networks, but I was troubled to learn that agencies are not equipped to make strategic investment decisions with money Congress provides. And while I could have assumed that agencies could improve their cyber incident response procedures or how cyber risks are communicated, I could not have predicted that just over half of the agencies surveyed had validated cyber incident response roles in the past year, and only 59% of agencies have a mechanism to issue enterprise-wide cyber threat alerts. We have to do better than this. The Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination Report identified important actions the federal government should undertake to resolve existing capability gaps. Many of the proposed solutions leverage CDM tools, some of which have yet to be fully implemented or may not be deployed anytime soon. Yesterday, this committee approved legislation Chairman Ratcliffe introduced and which I co-sponsored to make the CDM program more robust, more accountable. I will be interested in hearing from our witnesses about how the federal government can optimize the potential of CDM and improve its implementation. Additionally, I would be interested to know if the witnesses disagree with any of the action items identified in the risk determination report, or if there are critical or issues critical to risk management that the report failed to address. Finally, I'll be interested in hearing the witnesses' thoughts about the importance of leadership from the White House when it comes to improving the cybersecurity of our federal networks. Before I close, I want to point out on a separate subject that we're heading into August recess without making any progress towards reauthorization of the chemical facility anti-terrorism standards known as the CFATS program. Ranking Member Thompson and I have repeatedly asked the majority to hold oversight hearings with the department and begin work on negotiating informed CFATS reauthorization legislation. Neither has happened, and I am concerned that we may not have enough legislative days left to get reauthorization past the finish line. I hope the majority will make CFATS a priority when we return from the August recess so we can avoid a temporary extension. With that, I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to their testimony, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. Mr. Ken Durbin is a senior strategist of global government affairs for Symantec. Mr. Durbin has been providing compliance and risk management solutions to the public sector for over 25 years and has authored multiple articles on CRM issues. Thank you for being here this morning. Ms. Summer Fowler is the Technical Director for the Cybersecurity Risk and Resilience in the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon. In this role, Ms. Fowler is responsible for executing the strategic plan for a research portfolio focused on improving the security and resilience of organizational assets. Ms. Fowler, thank you for being here to provide your insights today. Finally, Mr. Ari Schwartz is the Managing Director of Cybersecurity Services in the Risk Management Group of Venable. Mr. Schwartz is testifying today on behalf of the Cybersecurity Coalition and Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. Prior to his time at Venable, Mr. Schwartz served on the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Cybersecurity. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Schwartz. I now ask the witnesses to stand and raise your right hand so I can swear you in to testify. Do each of you swear or affirm the testimony which you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses has been so sworn. You may be seated. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Mr. Durbin for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I would like to start by setting the stage with regards to the current threat landscape. Attackers continue to evolve. To avoid detection, attackers are employing what we call living off the land, using operating system features or legitimate network administration tools to compromise victims' networks. Using good programs to do bad things is difficult to detect because it is disguised as normal operations. We recently discovered one such attack that had compromised satellite operators, telecommunications companies, and a defense contractor. We identified the attack using an advanced hunting tool we call Targeted Attack Analytics, which crawls through massive data sets looking for minute indicators of malicious activity. Cryptojacking is another common attack. We've seen the rise of a new category of web-based coin miner attacks that use an individual's browser to hijack their computer's processing power to mine cryptocurrency. Detections of coin miners on endpoint computers increased by 8,500% in 2017. We saw an uptick in supply chain attacks, where attackers hijack software updates to gain entry to well-guarded networks. The Petya outbreak was the most notable example of a supply chain attack. Attackers used accounting software as the point of entry. Now turning to the Federal Cybersecurity Risk Determination Report and Action Plan. The report is a tough but fair assessment of the current state of the executive branch's cybersecurity posture, and it looks to build on existing security frameworks to make improvements. I want to take a moment to commend OMB for recognizing the value of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF, as a tool to improve the current state of the executive branch's risk management efforts. Typically, an agency collects data from over 200 FISMA controls across 10 control families to evaluate cybersecurity readiness. That same data can be consolidated into the 5 CSF functions for a clearer view into their cyber readiness. The report made several recommendations. In the first, the report notes that 38% of federal cyber incidents did not have an identified attack vector, and recommends implementing the Cyber Threat Framework, or CTF, to help categorize cybersecurity risks. However, it is not clear how categorizing attacks would have helped protect against the cyber events that compromised information and systems. To reduce the number of unidentified attacks, I recommend that, along with implementing the CTF, OMB put a strong emphasis on cybersecurity solutions that automate the detection and remediation of cyber events through communication between strategic control points, hunting for indicators of compromise. I commend OMB's efforts to develop a risk-based budget process to direct IT purchases to reduce identified risk. Another way to reduce identified risk would be to require agencies to add recommendations contained in IG FISMA audits as line items in their budget requests to ensure they receive adequate prioritization. The report also recommends standardizing IT and cybersecurity capabilities. This can be achieved through the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM, program. CDM achieves the same goals by focusing on standardized capabilities rather than a standardized vendor. However, the CDM program needs to be accelerated. 5 years after CDM was launched, phase 1 of 4 has still not been fully deployed. The third recommendation is to consolidate agency security operations centers to improve overall incident detection and response. While this is part of the solution, detecting the exfiltration of data requires more than consolidation, which brings me to the fourth recommendation, accountability. I want to focus on the data level protections aspect of this recommendation. Far too often, we see the government equate data level protection with the encryption of data. While encryption is important, the government's focus needs to be expanded to include prevention, specifically data loss prevention, or DLP. DLP can discover and categorize sensitive data and can enforce policies about what can be done with that data. DLP can automatically encrypt data before it's transmitted, even if the end user forgot to encrypt it themselves. I recommend that DHS advance the data protection phase of CDM, which would have the added benefit of protecting the high-value assets identified by agencies during the 2015 cyber sprint. I hope these observations build on OMB's recommendations and maximize their ability to improve our government cybersecurity posture. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Durbin. Chair now recognizes Ms. Fowler for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, and all subcommittee members for this opportunity. On behalf of my team at Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute CERT Cybersecurity Program, or SEI, I am excited to contribute today and share our research and experience in cyber risk determination. OMB's May 2018 report, as has been noted, contains 4 core recommendations that we believe are excellent steps to improving federal cybersecurity posture. Our work at the SEI can build on and enhance these recommendations. Cyber risk management requires analysis and mitigation of 2 sides, both the threat and of the consequence or impact of risks that occur. We know that our cyber exposure is increasing as software is embedded in more aspects of our lives and government operations, and our adversaries are using these exposures to launch more frequent and more sophisticated attacks. Understanding these threats is important, but cyber risk management is not only about managing cyber attack. Failures of technology, breakdowns in governance or process, human errors, and even physical phenomena like natural disasters are also cyber risks. Addressing cyber risks holistically requires a resilience approach, a word I was very happy to hear Mr. Ratcliffe using. And that approach focuses on mitigating the impact of any type of disruptive event. Operational resilience is the ability to achieve mission objectives before, during, and after any disruptive event, whether it is a cyber attack or a system failure. Fundamental to operational resilience is identifying and prioritizing assets that are critical to each organization's mission. Our team at the SEI has codified operational resilience in the CERT Resilience Management Model. We have applied this model in partnership with DHS by assessing over 600 organizations across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors. These voluntary assessments provide organizations with a baseline understanding of their cybersecurity capabilities. The assessment team also provides the organization with resource guides and recommendations on how to make improvements. The CERT RMM is used as a way to measure capabilities against the NIST cybersecurity framework and other industry standards. But the operational resilience approach moves beyond checklist compliance to enable organizations to make demonstrable steps to improve cybersecurity posture. Most importantly, CERT RMM does not require an organization to start a new cybersecurity program. It allows an organization to baseline capabilities and build a roadmap for improvement that is both complementary to and improves organizations' inputs to federal programs like the DHS CDM program. CERT RMM also provides a structured way for organizations to identify, analyze, and mitigate the risks of older or legacy information technology, as was noted in the OMB report as a major concern. In many cases, as the report recommends, deprecated legacy systems will be modernized or moved to platforms like the cloud. The asset management practices in CERT RMM ensure that the highest priority assets for each organization are addressed first. But introducing new capabilities like the cloud also introduces new cyber risks. CERT RMM provides structured guidance on the management of supply chain, including new ways to continuously measure and manage the risks of third-party dependencies. A holistic resilience approach is especially important as the government integrates cyber-physical systems into the federal landscape. Cyber-physical systems are often built with functionality as a primary goal and cybersecurity as a secondary or tertiary goal at best. The military and federal government are adopting cyber-physical systems in areas like medical devices in VA hospitals and census collection capabilities. To mitigate cyber risks, we must address both threats and consequences in a balanced way, with the focus on prioritization of assets that are most critical to our mission. Thank you for the opportunity to participate today and to discuss how we can advance cyber risk determination and management through operational resilience practices.
Thank you, Ms. Fowler. Chair now recognizes Mr. Schwartz for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Chairman Ratcliffe, Ranking Member Richmond, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our views on federal cybersecurity risk management. I do so in my role as coordinator of the Cybersecurity Coalition, the leading policy coalition of companies that develop cybersecurity products and services. These issues before us today are not new. 12 years ago, I was on an advisory board, the Information Security Privacy Advisory Board that NIST hosts. And at that time, the Government Reform Committee, the chairman of the Government Reform Committee, it was Tom Davis at the time, would give grades to cabinet agencies and how they were doing on cybersecurity. And we had before our advisory board the deputy CIO of one agency that had consistently failed for the past 8 years. And so I took this time, and this deputy CIO was actually retiring from government service at that time. So I thought that this was a good opportunity to hear from them directly as to why government agencies continue to fail. And I asked the question, what would it take for you to do to succeed? And he said, well, one time many years ago, I got a D, right? We got a D, and no one paid attention to that at all. So we're better off failing, right? We can get resources if we fail. If we use the resources that we're given, the best we're going to do is a D or a D minus. So what good is it for us to try and play to the tests and try and pass these tests as opposed to fail, right? Obviously, this is the totally, and this was a security expert that knew what he was talking about in the security space, but it had no incentive to do what government was pushing him to do. I think those incentives have changed in terms of the policy space, but not in terms of the leadership space, and not in terms of getting the attention and getting the resources needed to actually fix the problems. We've seen that the move to risk management, I think, helps agencies to tailor the tests themselves so that it's based more on risk to the particular agency as opposed to the basic checkbox that we used to have much more so under the old FISMA guidance before the reform bill, the reform FISMA of 2014 came forward. OMB suggests in their report that came out in May that the goal should be to empower the CIO. This has been done for years and years and has not succeeded. Instead, we should do exactly what, Mr. Chairman, you suggested in your opening statement, which is to make sure that we hold the leadership accountable. The Trump administration in their executive order says that that is their goal, to hold secretaries and deputy secretaries directly responsible for what happens at the agency in terms of cybersecurity. But the CIOs themselves have many, many jobs to do, and security is only a small part of what they do. Instead, we should move to do what has been happening in the private sector, which is to have the CISOs report to the leadership directly themselves, and have the CISOs make sure that the CISOs have some ability to influence the policy and make sure that then the leadership, when they ask questions from above, that they have the ability to go to the CISO and hear things directly from them. And the question is now, how do we hold that agency leadership accountable? And we make it so that there is a reason to pass and to do the right thing in this space. From my experience, I would suggest that having the director of OMB responsible for making sure that agency heads are paying attention to this issue as a central mission issue, right? When people don't come in to become the Secretary of the Interior or the Secretary of Agriculture or others in order to do cybersecurity, but you still have to make it part of their mission to do so. And that's going to take OMB, that's going to take the White House Chief of Staff making these calls and making sure that it's not just an incident that gets the attention of the Secretary, but that it's on the radar all the time. You can also do this at the Deputy Director level with the Deputy Director of Management and making sure that they're the ones making the calls. And of course, Congress, in your regular oversight of agencies, when you have those secretaries and deputy secretaries in front of you, can ask these questions at other hearings as well and make sure that they're being held responsible for what's happening at the agencies. Now's the time to make sure that we have that the agencies are being held responsible for their failures and rapidly addressing these known risks. I thank you again for having me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Donovan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for sharing your expertise with us. About to show you how I lack expertise. I have a VCR back home that still flashes 12. And you can't see because you're facing us, but all the young people behind you now are Googling what's a VCR. So just so I can understand the problem properly, if we're protecting our gold in Fort Knox, and there's only one entrance in there, we have a good chance of making sure anybody who gets through there is a person that ought to get through, unless they're disguising themselves as someone else. And I guess in your field, you call that just looking like a friendly user to get into a network when you're actually an infiltrator. The difficulty is when you have more than one entrance, I guess, or if you've secured your entrance, but there are other people who have entrances and aren't securing it as well as you are, that causes vulnerabilities in Fort Knox and causes vulnerabilities in systems, I suspect. Because it was hard for me to grasp before I joined this committee on, like, why can't we just protect this? And if we know as much as the bad guy, do we anticipate what they're going to do? And I think Ms. Fowler, you used the word resiliency, and Chairman used the word resiliency. Before we have a tragedy or an intruder. So could you kind of like frame the problem for me so I could understand it? Because I think I have to understand the problem before we could actually come up with or understanding what your suggested solutions are.
Okay. Thank you for the question. It is a complex situation. A lot of it has to do with the diversity of the federal government, the diversity of the agencies, how they're organized. Some are more flat, some are federated, some have more resources than others do. So it's coming up with a common baseline of what is it that we have and what is it that we're trying to protect. And I believe that the CDM program in their phase one certainly is trying to fix that situation by doing that definition. Phase one, the goal is to go out and identify all hardware and software assets. Because someone made the comment, and it's very true, you can't defend what you can't see. So now that we are closing in on the end of phase one, we'll have a much better look at what it is we're trying to defend so that we know what all those different entry points are that you referred to. And then we can work on providing protections against all of those different attack vectors. The other issues are legacy systems that we've talked about. You have a disparity between different people's products and solutions that they're using for access management or for determining who is qualified, who has privileges to access a certain system, and should they have those accesses. So a lot of this needs to be discovered and baselined so that we have an understanding of what the problems are, and then we can come up with solutions to solve them.
Thank you, Ms. Fowler.
Yes, I'm excited to hear you use the word resilience because it really is about resilience. When you use the example of gold that needs to be protected, it's not even just against someone who's trying to steal that gold, but when we think about the fact that the gold is housed somewhere, it's in a container, could it be impacted by a natural disaster? Could someone who's working there make a mistake? And that would also cause us to lose our ability to access or use that gold. So we really want to look at this from a holistic standpoint of not just trying to figure out what it is that an adversary is trying to do, but to understand what it is that is most important to us and how we can ensure that it won't be impacted in any negative way, right, from any sort of disruption. That really even starts before understanding what our assets are, and that is related to what we talked about with having leadership have a real skin in this game. It's being able to articulate and communicate what it is that we're trying to achieve from a mission standpoint. So, organizations like Health and Human Services and Department of Energy have different missions that they need to achieve. They have different services that they're going to provide to achieve those missions, and then the assets that support those services are what we really need to protect. And so it's the identification of the assets that are important to each mission. And the way we can use the limited resources that we have best is to be able to articulate our risk appetite against those assets that are in our organizations and make sure that that programs like CDM are focused on those. And so, my way of explaining this to you would be, let's not just look at this in terms of a threat from a cyber attack, but a holistic, how do we protect against the impact of any negative consequence?
Wonderful. Thank you. Mr. Schwartz?
You talked about protecting the gold in Fort Knox, but that reminds me of a saying that they use in the military about protecting diamonds and toothbrushes, which is we don't protect. If we were to protect diamonds the same way we protect our toothbrushes, we'd have a lot of toothbrushes and not very many diamonds. And that's part of what both Mr. Durbin and Ms. Fowler are discussing here, which is how do we do risk management in this space in a way that where we can identify the assets and then do the risk profile in a way that makes sure that we're protecting that information in the right way that it's been that it needs to be protected. Prior to the NIST framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, which Mr. Durbin mentioned, the federal government actually pretty much just had a list of the things you need to do for every system, and didn't really take the less important systems or more important systems and kind of do that balancing test of how should we be protecting this particular system. Now we're moving towards a time when we are doing that kind of risk management, and that's what this OMB report's really about, is how agencies are looking at risk in this space. How are they identifying it? How do they do these different pieces, right? The NIST profile is broken up into identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, which I break up into two pieces. One is the defense side, so the identify and protect, and then the other side, detect, respond, recover, I think of as the resilience side, as Ms. Fowler's been saying, right? So that's how do you get at to do both sides of that and make sure you're doing it the right way for each system. And that's the kind of approach that now agencies are taking for the most part, but they still have problems in terms of actually putting the protections in place, actually making sure that they're resilient in the way that they need to be, even for the most critical systems.
I thank you all again for your expertise. Mr. Chairman, I yield back which time I don't have anymore.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Richmond. You can recognize Langevin. Chair recognizes my friend and colleague from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member. Thank the panel also for their testimony here today and the expertise, the insights that you bring to these challenging topics. Let me begin, if I could, with Mr. Schwartz. You spoke of the need to hold secretaries, not CISOs, accountable for the security of their agencies' networks. And I certainly would agree. And I remember what happened after when Secretary of Defense Ash Carter started taking a deeper interest in this topic and doing a deep dive and requiring weekly reports being given to him, and even on the issue of establishing a bug bounty program. When he said, we're going to make this happen, he started telling people and programs to get out of their way and make it happen. It did. So I can see why it's so important to have secretary buy-in. But you know, it seems that for years, poor results on FISMA scorecards have not been enough in other agencies, though, to motivate action. So my question is, what could the administration do to encourage real action to address these continued deficiencies and ensure cybersecurity leadership at the highest levels? And again, from your perspective, why is it so important to have secretarial buy-in?
Thank you, Mr. Landry. Thank you for your continued leadership on these issues, too. I think there's a lot in that question in terms of how do we get leadership to actually focus on this. I do think that the executive order, the Trump executive order that came out in May of 2017, actually put us in the right place, which is before the secretaries had all of their goals in place, they were told that that cybersecurity was a major issue. But it takes staying on top of that to do that. That means holding cabinet meetings around cybersecurity, and the president going around and asking each agency what they're doing, holding up the report card from OMB and asking them, what are you doing to do more, right? That is what really taking this issue, taking the executive order and actually implementing it means in this space. I realize that there are a lot of other things going on, but that's what's going to make a difference in this area, is making sure that the secretary knows that they're going to be going into a meeting and that they have to prepare for it, and the 50 people that follow them around and do it every day and do that thing for that day, this is going to be the thing that we're doing today, right? And therefore, everything needs to be aligned, and we need to get the CISO in front of us so he can give us the answers of what we need. Right? And that's the only way that it's going to change. And that's what CEOs, this is the same thing that's happening in the private sector too. Not every company is doing this. Those that are more successful.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if the top people aren't paying attention to this, then clearly it becomes a secondary priority. But the president or the cabinet secretaries are the ones that are driving this, then clearly everyone's going to stand up, shine their shoes, and get this done the right way. So, Mr. Schwartz, on another issue, small and medium-sized businesses have largely resorted to outsourcing not just their IT, but also the security of their IT, given their limited budgets. In a similar vein, the OMB report suggests that shared services are key to addressing risk management issues, yet we've made little progress to that end. So, Mr. Schwartz, if you could, what barriers do agencies face in getting to shared or outsourced services, and how do we overcome them?
Yeah, the shared services one is a tricky problem for a lot of agencies. Part of it is just the culture of the fact that they've been doing internal security for years and years, and they have to move away from that and spend the money on the cloud company doing the protections for them rather than keeping that same security in-house. They're never going to be able to, the small agencies in particular, those that don't even have a large IT department, are never going to be able to have enough security professionals and technology to protect themselves, whereas the cloud companies specialize in that, and managed security services specialize in that. So there is a need to move in that way. I think one of the main challenges that they face are really procurement challenges, though, because you want to do oversight of the agencies that you're in charge of doing oversight over. If they're turning over a lot of their budget to other agencies in order to run their services, you lose oversight over their IT, right? And I understand that from a congressional point of view, but that's how we're going to improve with the small and medium-sized agencies, is by members of Congress understanding that and being willing to take the risk of saying, okay, we understand this is going in someone else's purview, we're losing some control here, but that's but we know that that agency has security in place and that they have oversight over what they're doing as well. And our information being held by that agency and being overseen by companies in that space that run the managed services in that space is going to be acceptable.
Very good. Thank you for those answers. As you can imagine, I have several more, but time's expired, so I'll yield back, and I'll have some questions to submit for the record unless we go to a second round. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, for
Thank you,
5
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman. Appreciate it. And thank you for coming in here, sharing your expertise. I used to work in the cyber offensive side a little bit, cyber intelligence side, and we have some of the best capabilities in the world there, but we're also the most vulnerable when it comes to defense and other people's cyber attack. I heard a cyber leader once describe us as living in a big glass house. We had the biggest rocks. Not very comforting at times. One of the things that the OMB and DHS report calls for is the consolidations of the Security Operations Center. And instead of each one having their own, but consolidating it to one big one. Do you see that as a significant advantage, or does it make everybody equally vulnerable? If you get into one, you get into everybody. So I'd like to have your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. So having a SOC for the sake of having a SOC may not be the best strategy. It comes down to your ability to stand up a SOC that has the right tools and capabilities to accomplish what it is you're trying to do. So if you're in a position where it would be better for you to merge with somebody else's SOC that has proven technologies and has the excess capability, that might be the better way to go. So I agree with the recommendation of the report that consolidation of SOCs will improve some efficiencies.
So it gives the best capabilities available for everybody. So
Exactly,
it-
yes.
So
Now,
it standardizes the best. Mm-hmm. Okay.
yes, and of course it does. You need to make sure that you consolidate to a SOC that does have the excess capacity and that does have the tools in place that are going to accomplish the mission. This recommendation was also made around the idea of improving the ability to detect data exfiltration. And simply consolidating SOCs may not accomplish that. The SOC has to have the right tools to be able to discover where the data lives and tag that data as sensitive so that you can then monitor.
But by consolidating, we can invest in that one and make sure that we have the best capabilities.
Exactly.
I would say. Any different? Would you all just agree?
Agreed.
Okay. Are we doing better, Mr. Schwartz, when it comes to sharing intel data? Because we don't have a lot of silos. I mean, you were touching on this with Mr. Langevin a little bit. But are we doing better, making progress?
There's some progress there. I think a lot of the private sector is still really frustrated. A lot of it comes down to getting security clearances and the right people getting the information. So I do still hear a lot of frustration. I think internally inside the government it's gotten a lot better, though. So.
It seems to me having a combined security operations center allows you to share that data faster because you can see where there is infiltration or exfiltration. I had just a question, Mr. Durbin, because this fascinates me. Evidently, you've talked about a group called, well, let me just read it here. Symantec is clearly engaged regarding a new attack group known as THRIP and the ways in which they are living off the land in order to get info systems. Can you talk about this new threat and living off the land? What does that mean, and what kind of a cyber threat is this?
So living off the land is how we're describing a technique where if an attack group creates a complex, sophisticated piece of malware that they use to infiltrate a system, it's going to be relatively easier to detect that because we haven't seen it before, it doesn't look right, it raises a flag. So if an attack group can utilize a network administration tool that administrators commonly use to scan networks to see what they have, and somebody sees that activity inside the network, it's not going to raise a flag.
It's camouflaged.
Yeah, they could say, okay, well, somebody's just scanning the network because that's part of what they do.
Right.
So that's just one example. Using PowerShell scripts and things is just ways to mask their abilities, so that it's not as easy to detect.
It makes sense. One last question. I know the Russians use a lot of phishing techniques. That's how they got into the DNC server. It seems to me that is makes us the most vulnerable is that technique. What can we do to better defend against these phishing techniques that are going on? And I just open up to whoever feels like they have the best answer.
Go ahead.
Well, I would say getting better identity management is really the key to the phishing techniques. I mean, right now, a lot of times we still rely on username passwords, and moving towards techniques that move beyond that. They talk about that a bit in the report about that there has been a move towards use of cards, which I think does help to some degree inside the government. But it's really about the credential and whether you can secure that credential.
We absolutely do see phishing as one of the most common vectors for having attacks occur. A couple of things that we need to do. One is training, although we know that no matter how much we train people over and over, it takes just one person to hit the link and cause the issue to occur. So thinking about advances in terms of automation and analytics and the things that we're doing in the areas of machine learning. So this is going to take us advancing past our adversaries' capabilities and investing in the research that will get us there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognize my friend from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think you touched on it a little bit, but from my perspective, when it comes to our federal network security, I see at least two systematic problems, but they stem directly from the White House, one of which is the tendency to undercut or diminish the role of authority figures. Eliminating the cybersecurity coordinator is a good example. Second is taking far too long to fill senior positions like chief information officers. And at the end of last year, nearly 1/3 of the agencies were still operating without a permanent CIO. And the federal CIO was not named until January, and the federal CISO was selected just last week. How important is strong, clear leadership structures when it comes to cybersecurity, particularly for an agency trying to instill a culture of risk awareness? And I know, Mr. Schwartz, you mentioned having a chief executive that will hold people's feet to the fire. The question becomes, can that be delegated? And without a cybersecurity coordinator, where do we find ourselves? So anyone can answer that. We'll start with Mr. Schwartz.
Yeah, I've always felt that the cybersecurity coordinator should be, it should be brought up to be a deputy level. There was a commission, the Obama commission that was reporting for the next president, suggested that it be raised to a assistant to the president, but I actually think it makes sense to have it at the deputy level, particularly for the reason of being able to call out deputy secretaries on these kind of issues and make sure that they're held accountable. Getting rid of that position totally, I think, is a step backward from being able to do that. I mean, you can have a deputy play that role, but they're going to have 90 other jobs, right? So how much time can they actually spend calling up deputies and asking them how they're doing on cybersecurity, as opposed to having someone dedicated to it that's doing offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities inside the government, as well as critical infrastructure protection too, but having this one piece to be part of their job as a deputy at the level of deputies, I think makes a lot of sense. Again, I think that they took a major step backwards by getting rid of the position totally rather than elevating it the way they should have.
I agree that governance and leadership are the most critical first step in establishing good cyber risk management practices. It's also a matter of making sure that the workforce itself who's in those positions are trained in these areas and understand how to manage cyber risk like other risks are managed. We often look at cybersecurity as something that is special or not understood, and really we need to manage cyber risk like we manage other risks inside of the organization, and that's a matter of using those limited resources in the best way possible. So the leaders that we do put in place, it's incumbent that they set that risk appetite and understand what the tolerance ranges are for that organization and communicate those to the workforce. The workforce is doing the absolute best that they can to do all of the right technical things. It's just ensuring that they're provided the guidance that it's going in the right step. So the governance aspect of this is that most important first step.
And I would just simply add that no matter what cybersecurity program you're trying to set up, it's key to get buy-in from all levels of the organization, and that's no different with the federal government.
Let me let me ask this, because I think that it also came up, but the federal government's always lagging behind the times, and we're about 10 years back from where we should be in terms of our cybersecurity. How can Congress empower or provide the resources for our federal agencies to actually be proactive and better prepared for the future and anticipate the risk as opposed to always being on the back end?
So I'll speak to that in terms of what I think is required for us as a nation to move forward. And you'll see in the written testimony, I think this requires a national initiative to address cybersecurity as a need across all sectors. You know, in 1961, we made this goal to put a human being on the moon, and that sparked interest in a whole lot of different science and technology that was developed. We need to have a similar initiative which goes down into our education levels, at all levels, starting very early, which makes this a part of every level of education so that the workforce in the future is prepared for this. We saw this with Estonia. When Estonia experienced their crippling attacks, that government decided to really put the initiative forward to educate across all levels of their citizenship, and now they are recognized, maybe arguably, but as the #1 in cybersecurity in all of Europe. And I see that we need to put forth an educational initiative that will prepare our workforce for this in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. See that my time has expired, so I'll just yield back.
Yeah, let me give you all, I very much appreciated, first of all, the Chair recognized himself for questions. Ms. Fowler, very much appreciated your remarks there, and I agree. I have talked about a cyber moonshot and identifying an approach that will address some of the concerns that you related. And if you believe, as I do, that cybersecurity risks present perhaps our greatest national security threat right now and going forward, then we need to have some sort of a cyber moonshot to address those threats. But I want to give each of the witnesses a chance to weigh in on the ranking member's very good question, one that I had as well. So, Mr. Durbin.
If you were to take a look at the original CDM documents 5 years ago and look at the projections of where they thought they would be by now, we would be in much better shape. There are reasons why we're not there yet. Phase 1 is a critical phase. It builds the foundation. We basically had told the agencies, let us know or give us an inventory of all of your assets so that we can then turn around and provide you with a tool that's going to give you an accurate inventory count. So there was no shock when, after phase 1 was deployed and that tool was turned on, the number of assets in the agencies was found to be severely underreported. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that we now have visibility into what it is we're trying to protect. So that took more time than they originally thought. So if we were to accelerate the other phases And let's get to the point where we can automate the authority to operate process. Every 72 hours, we're doing a scan, so an organization knows, am I able to operate? Do I have deficiencies that need to be repaired? In kind of real time, I think that would put us in a much better position. They did add data protection as a phase 4. I applaud them for that, but that's what the bad guys are after. They're after the data. So while we're trying to figure everything else out, let's protect the data. Let's lock that down.
Terrific. Thank you. Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Responding directly to your comments on this issue about the cyber moonshot, and the threat that comes from cyber in the space compared to other threats. I mean, look at what we've done on terrorism, right? We've done a pretty good job in terms of trying to resource out how we protect this country from terrorism. But we've been told for the past 7 years that cyber is overtaking terrorism as the most major threat to this country, and we're not getting the resources to cyber that we have for terrorism. So I'm not sure that that's a moonshot or what you call it, but it would be, there is this question of paying as much attention to this problem as to address it in the way that we think of it as the size problem that it actually is. And that's why I focus on, you have to have cabinet level meetings in order to do that. You have to put the resources towards it that are commensurate with it. And we're not doing that now. So we can't expect to get the results particularly at small agencies in order to protect themselves when we're not helping them out to do that.
Terrific. Thank you. As I mentioned in my opening, the OMB and DHS report that I think the specific number was that 71 of 96 federal agencies have cybersecurity programs that are either at risk or at high risk. And a statistic that really jumped out at me as being particularly disturbing. And I'm wondering if the number surprised you as you read that, and whether it does or not. When we talk about reversing the trend there, I mean, I mentioned CDM as a solution there, but I want to make sure that we're talking about all the potential solutions to reversing that trend and give you all a chance to weigh in on making those points.
So I guess the percentage didn't surprise me all that much, given the fact that CDM is behind, and that some of the recommendations made in last year's executive order are just now starting to take hold. Again, it didn't surprise me. I do see CDM as a way to fix a lot of what's in that report. Instead of creating a new program, let's utilize what's already there and let's improve it, let's empower it, so that we can target those specific issues and bring that percentage down as quickly as possible.
Terrific. Thank you.
I would agree that the 71 is not surprising. It's also consistent with what we've seen through our work with DHS, what the SCI has done with DHS in looking at the private sector with the owners and operators of critical infrastructure. I would say that CDM and accelerating that program will be help in terms of giving us visibility into what our capabilities are. Again, I do want us to see us move towards an operational resilience approach, where even before we start thinking about what it is in terms of a threat actor that we need to worry about, that we think about the most critical assets inside of each organization.
So can I stop you there, Ms.
Sure.
Fowler? Because you talk about that in terms of the resilience factor. Are there key metrics that we can be looking at to determine how effective we are being in terms of making progress on resilience?
Absolutely. We do have something called the Cyber Resilience Review, which is a set of questions that look across 10 domains of cybersecurity. And that can help give a maturity measure of how you are doing in terms of the completeness of the practices and also the institutionalization or sophistication of the practices that you have in place. The third element of that is something that you yourself mentioned, sir, which is efficacy of practice. And that's something that has been a concern and continues to be a concern back at the SEI, because we can be doing a lot of things very well, and they might not be the right things to do. And much like we do in the medical industry, we set up very rigorously, scientifically rigorous tests. And we do a lot of data analysis behind whether or not those tests work in very specific ways. We don't have a lot of those practices occurring in cybersecurity to say, does this control actually do what we want it to do in the face of this threat? That's something that I think that the government could invest research into to make sure that the efficacy of the practices are as good as the completeness of the practices.
Great point. Thank you. Mr. Schwartz, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. So, I mean, I addressed this in my oral testimony, but just to take it a little bit further, I mean, what do we do with agencies that are a high risk? Do we spend more money there? Do you give them more money to continue to fail? Do you give them, do you fire people so they have less people there to do the job that they need to do? I think each agency is sort of its own case. And you need to go in, what we need to do is give people a reason to succeed and make sure that the leadership understands what they need to do to succeed. Sometimes there are a lot of barriers in the way to success. Okay, then you got to tackle those one at a time and get the right people from the entire agency in order to do that and to address those one at a time. But it involves digging in each of those agencies and figuring out what the right path to success is. It's part of what risk management is, but it's also just management at an agency at this point.
Well, I want to thank all of our witnesses. This has been incredibly insightful and valuable for all of us. Thank you all for being here today. I also want to thank the members of the committee for their questions and remind them that they can submit additional questions for the witnesses, and it sounds like at least one of the members will. And we'll ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will remain held open for a period of 10 days, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.